Welcome back, everyone. We're here this week on another edition of our Wellness and Weight Loss Wednesday show, where we're going over a follow-up from last week. And last week we spoke about carb cycling. Many of you familiar with carb cycling when you're looking at your macros, when you're trying to calculate how many grams of carbohydrates to eat per day. But also there's something called macro cycling. And macro cycling is also looking at total grams of fat, protein, and carbs per day, but it does it in a little bit different light. So what I want to share with you today is the difference between carb cycling and macro cycling, allow you to choose the one that fits better for you in your life, and honestly figure out one that will hopefully be a whole lot simpler to stick to. One of the reasons why I say that is that we know the people that do best with diets are those that find a diet plan that they are able to stick to with not a lot of aggravation and then get consistent results from it. That, of course, is what we hope to do every single day in our practice with people all over the world, is keep it simple, keep it based on foundational principles, and allow them to understand that they're going to get their biggest benefits over time. So yes, we want the upfront results, but you get the upfront results with something like a 21-day functional medicine detox, or the first phase and second phase of Fatlocity. All of those are going to get you those short-term results, but you also need a long-term plan. This has been my biggest thing for so long, is that there are so many diet plans that can get people upfront results, but what about the next month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months? If you put people's body into a state of survival, their bodies are going to shut down fat-burning hormones. And again, we've been talking about that over the past couple weeks. Hopefully you tuned in to episode 2070, how intermittent fasting affects fat-burning hormones. And then last week, how to use carb cycling to lose weight. So what I want to share with you is just a quick recap on carb cycling. If you are using carb cycling, for the most part, people are essentially looking at high carb days, moderate carbohydrate days, and then low carb days. Let's say a high carb day might be 150 grams of carbohydrates. A moderate carbohydrate day would be 100 grams per day. And then a low carbohydrate day might be 50 grams of carbs for the day. You can eat all those 150 grams of carbs all in one meal if you'd like, or typically it's split over 2 or 3 meals. So that 150 grams a day of carbs, you would have 50 at breakfast, 50 grams at lunch, and 50 grams of carbs at dinner. If it was 100 grams, 33 grams at each meal, and it was 50 grams of carbs, you might skip carbs altogether at dinner and maybe just have 25 at breakfast, 25 at lunch. That's just a rudimentary example of carbohydrate cycling, and the way that you would typically do it is on your bigger, more intense exercise days, like especially a high intensity interval training day. That might be one where you do a higher carbohydrate day. And then a day where you're doing more aerobic based cardio. Okay, that's more of a moderate carbohydrate day. And then when you're doing, you have an off day, you're just doing walking for your day, that's going to be a lower carb day. Many people are using this. They're using it successfully. And if you're getting great results, honestly, and you don't mind trying to figure out which day is what, keep on going with it. I have no issues with that, because essentially what you're achieving with this diet plan is energy balance, right? So the days where you have more output, you are taking in more energy-based food. And the primary energy source for our body in terms of food is carbohydrates. A lot of people like to make things up and say it's fats. It's not fats. It's definitely carbohydrates. So again, it doesn't mean that you have to eat a high carb diet or a moderate or even a low. But what it is human physiology and how our body converts glucose to usable energy, or from glucose, or putting sugar in our body, carbohydrates in our body, saving it as glycogen, using that on a rainy day as we need it for actual glucose-based maintenance for the body and for the brain. And yes, we've talked about ketones many times in the show. There's a time and place. But what I'd like to share is, and again, if you want to go in depth and learn more about carb cycling, what I'd love you to do is head on over to stevencabral.com/2077 for that full show. So the issue is, let's say you're doing 2 high-intensity interval training days per week. So that means you have 2 higher carb days. You have 2 aerobic days. So you have 2 moderate days. And then maybe you have 3 off days for the week. Okay, because you have 4 workouts for the week, 2 high, 2 moderate, and then you have 3 off days. Okay, so that means that you need to come up with meal plans for 2 high carb days, 2 moderate carb days, and then 3 low carb days. Now, again, that might be no big deal for you. You're great at meal planning. You're great at tweaking your carbohydrates, and that's not an issue. And I give you examples of how to do that on episode 2077. But there's a lot of people out there where it's just too much to think about. They're not great with being able to figure out how many carbohydrates are in what food. And just for whatever reason, they just don't find it works in their life. Well, there's another method of carb cycling, and that is macro cycling. And what macro cycling looks at is your overall macronutrients, your fat, your protein, and carbohydrates. Okay. Not radically different than carb cycling, but instead of just looking at carbohydrates as the factor, it actually takes into consideration typically fat and carbohydrates. Let me give you an example. If you're eating, let's say the average person's eating 1,600 calories a day. Okay, let's say that you're typically doing 40% of your diet, let's say, is protein. I'm just making up numbers. Again, yours might be 30%, it might be 20%, whatever it is, great. So let's say that it's 40%. Okay, so if you are taking 40%, I made the math hard for myself. So 1,600, 160, 160 is 320. What's that? 640, right? So 640 carbohydrates out of your calories out of your day is going towards protein. So it's one way to look at it. It's 40%. So now you say, okay, well, I have now 60% of my diet can come from fat and from carbohydrates. So it's your job now, if 40% is always your set amount for your protein, to divvy up your carbs and your fat on a weekly basis. Now, what most people do in terms of macro cycling is that they simply do it every 2 weeks. So this is an example of what macro cycling would look like. And a lot of people find it much easier. So for 2 weeks, they'll do 40% protein, 20% carbs, and 20% fat. And what they'll do is they'll just take their total calories for the day and they'll divide that by the percentage. So 40% protein. Let's just make sure the math, because I'm doing math on a podcast now. So if we have 1,600 and we multiply by 0.4, we get 640. I wasn't too far off. That's good. And then, of course, half of that for your carbs is 320. So we have 640 calories from protein, 640 calories from fat, and we've got 320 calories from carbohydrates. So what that allows you to do, and if I just do 320 calories divided by 4, I get 80 grams of carbs. For those 2 weeks, then, each day a person would be limited to 80 grams of carbohydrates per day. So you can come up with what would equate then to the same macronutrient ratio every single day for your meals. And let's say you're doing 3 meals per day. What you're then calculating is, okay, I need 160 grams of protein, 640 divided by 9. Let's do the math on that, because that's how many calories there are in fat. 71 grams of fat. And then I have my 80 grams of carbs. So all you're going to do is divide that over your 3 meals or 4 meals, whatever you're deciding to do. And that is how you can build each macronutrient ratio for each meal. So it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. It would still allow you to do maybe even 40 carbs at breakfast, 40 at lunch, and then 0 at dinner. However you wanted to create it, you could still create it as long as you're meeting your macros total for the day. But this is where it gets to be just a little bit different. So that would allow someone to do, let's say, lower carbohydrates for 2 weeks, get the benefits maybe of doing some carb cycling right there. But then what they're going to do is after 2 weeks, they'll drop their fat to 20% and they'll increase their carbs by 20%. So now it looks like 40% protein because they're keeping that ratio the same. Okay, that macronutrient stays at 40. They're doing 40% carbs, and then they're doing 20% from fat. Again, I'm not telling you that those are what your macros should be. It's just pretty straightforward macros for macro cycling. So then for 2 weeks, you're now a little bit higher in carbs, right? So your fat would go to 71, divide that by half, 36 or so. And then your carbs would go to 160 a day. Now, again, that might be a lot of carbs for certain individuals. However, that increase in carbohydrates might give them a bigger boost in overall energy, brain clarity before they take it down over those next 2 weeks. So I'm not here to necessarily tell you, is macro cycling better for you, which is what I just explained, 2 weeks of higher carbs than 2 weeks of lower carbs and switching out your fat and your carbs, or is carb cycling? In my practice, I have seen carbohydrate cycling to be a more effective measure of fat loss than macro cycling. And I'm going to give you a really explanation as to why as well. If you even just look at total calorie intake for the day, when you are doing carb cycling and you are on lower carb days or moderate carb days, you are not increasing your fat intake. You are increasing your nutrient-dense vegetable intake and your lower starchy vegetables or lower fruit as well, and your fruit as well. So it enables you to actually hit a caloric deficit and better stabilize blood sugar. And that's why I've seen it to be more effective. So if you're trying to maximize body fat and weight loss, I've definitely seen carb cycling be more effective. However, if that's just too overwhelming for you in terms of how to schedule up and down days, the macro cycling could be far more effective for you because it is much easier for you to stick with. And if you stick with the diet over time, you're going to get much better benefits. So back in my day, like 20 plus years ago, when I was looking at more bodybuilding routines, they would actually call it more of an anabolic nutrition plan. So I remember EAS, Bill Phillips, and a bunch of people, they didn't coin that term because it had been around for a while. But what you would do is you would do higher carbs for 2 weeks. You would replenish glycogen stores. You'd get in great workouts, and then you'd go lower carbs for 2 weeks, and you'd go higher fat. So this has been around a really long time. Now that I'm saying that, it's been more like it's been over 20 years. So this is more like an anabolic diet. So the names change over the years, but honestly, the concepts always remain the same. Now, you might choose a different macro cycling nutrient ratio. So instead of doing 40% protein, yours might never go above 30% protein, and you might play with your carbs and fat there. So I'll let you really decide what formula works best for you. But I'd be remiss if I left out just one last thing. In the end, we never really use any of these things for our clients. They can be effective. There's no doubt about it. But what we typically do is we are simply doing a lower carbohydrate diet for 21 days. We're doing that with our 21-day functional medicine detox. You can learn more about it at stephencabral.com/detox, or we're using our Fatlocity weight loss system, and that is at stephencabral.com/fatlocity. You can check out either one of those. You're welcome to, but I'm just going to give you exactly what we do. So we use a lower carbohydrate system for those 3 weeks. It's predominantly vegetables. And then what we are doing is a reverse dieting methodology, which allows people to then gradually find their carbohydrate tolerance and add more berries and low glycemic fruit back in first, then additional starches, and so on and so forth. Because what really matters is that you're rebuilding your leptin resistance, your insulin resistance, and that over time, you're repairing your cell membrane dynamics, which is what enables you to process carbohydrates, sugar, glucose in the first point. So we just understand that people are not going to be able to return and repair all of those cells for 3 to 4 months. So why have them get frustrated? So we're starting low carb, and then we're easing the carbs back in. We know that they're going to hit a steady state point for a period of like a month or two. Then they're gradually going to be able to increase more, especially with more exercise output. And then they can eat more carbohydrates. They can increase their overall calories. So now their fat burning goes up, their thyroid goes up, their stress levels and cortisol cortisol levels go down. It's honestly, it's the safest, the healthiest, and the most scientific way to do it. It really is, rather than trying to manipulate and hack your body. But again, I'm not against carb cycling. I'm not against macro cycling. I just don't want people to burn out their hormones and burn out their metabolism for the long run. So if you've found a lot of great success with either carb cycling or macro cycling, stick with it. I commend you. There are times and places that certainly I do use it and do recommend it. But overall, I try to keep things simple for our wellness clients. And I know that consistency over time is what wins the race. Thank you so much for tuning in today. You can find all of today's show notes at stephencabral.com/2084, stephencabral.com/2084. And of course, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out at cabralsupportgroup.com or support@equa.life. Thank you so much, everyone. Have an amazing rest of the day, and I'll talk with you soon.